Daniel Hayes adjusted his sunglasses as he leaned back against the car door, the salty breeze of the boardwalk brushing against his face. This vacation was a rare chance to let his guard down, a break from the high-stakes world of undercover operations. His wife Mia's laughter filled the air as she chased their youngest, Malcolm, along the boardwalk, the 7-year-old squealing with delight. Zoe, their teenage daughter, lagged behind, earbuds in, distracted by her phone, but occasionally glancing up to smile at her family. For Daniel, this was more than a vacation. It was a carefully calculated move to blend in while he kept tabs on a local extremist group. His FBI team had intel that this sleepy beachside town wasn't as idyllic as it seemed. Underneath the sun-soaked facade lurked a network planning something catastrophic. The mission required absolute anonymity, and a family vacation provided the perfect cover. Yet, something about the way people were staring at them made him uneasy. It wasn't overt hostility, more a quiet, simmering discomfort. A shopkeeper's forced smile. A passerby pulling their child closer. Daniel noticed these things, his years of training fine-tuning his ability to read people. Mia seemed oblivious, too caught up in enjoying the day, but Daniel couldn't ignore the subtle tension in the air. As the family reached a stall selling ice cream, a patrol car cruised slowly past them. The officer in the passenger seat stared, his eyes lingering too long on Daniel. It wasn't curiosity, it was scrutiny. Daniel felt the weight of the gaze, but forced himself to remain casual. He'd seen this before, more times than he cared to remember. He knew the look, suspicion, fear, judgment. "Strawberry or chocolate, buddy?" Daniel asked Malcolm, crouching down to his son's level to block his view of the patrol car. Malcolm didn't notice, too busy debating his flavor choice. "Strawberry," Malcolm chirped, completely unaware of the undercurrent of tension his father was trying to shield him from. Zoe pulled out her earbuds. "Dad, why is that cop staring at us?" she asked in a low voice, her teenage bluntness cutting straight to the point. Daniel didn't answer immediately, taking a deep breath as he handed Malcolm his cone. "Probably nothing," he said evenly, though his instincts told him otherwise. "Let's just enjoy the day." But the patrol car didn't keep moving. Instead, it pulled over a few feet ahead. The officer stepped out, one adjusting his belt, the other pulling out a notepad. Daniel stiffened. Mia noticed it too, her carefree smile fading. "What's going on?" she whispered, her voice tight. "Stay calm," Daniel replied under his breath, his eyes locked on the approaching officers. "Afternoon," the taller officer said, his tone overly casual as he stopped a few feet away. "Mind if we ask you a few questions?" Daniel straightened, his hands loose at his sides, his FBI instincts kicking in. "Sure. What's this about?" The officer glanced at his partner, then back at Daniel. "We got a report about a suspicious group matching your description. Someone claimed they saw you around the shops earlier, acting unusual." Mia frowned. "Unusual? We're on vacation." "Ma'am, we're just following up," the officer replied, his tone hardening. Zoe stepped closer to her dad, her earlier teenage aloofness replaced with visible unease. "We didn't do anything," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Daniel raised a calming hand. "It's okay, Zoe." Then, turning to the officers, he added, "We're happy to cooperate, but I'd appreciate it if you could explain exactly what's going on." The second officer, shorter and stockier, crossed his arms. "Like I said, we're investigating a report. We need to check your IDs." Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, calculating his next move. Showing his FBI credentials would blow his cover, jeopardizing months of work. But not showing them might escalate the situation. He glanced at Mia, whose expression was a mix of confusion and fear, and then at Malcolm, happily licking his ice cream, oblivious to the tension. "Of course," Daniel said finally, reaching for his wallet. He handed over his driver's license, keeping his FBI badge tucked away in the hidden compartment. Mia did the same, her hands trembling slightly as she handed over her ID. The officer studied the licenses, their expressions unreadable. The taller one nodded toward Zoe. "And hers?" "She's a minor," Daniel replied, his tone firm. "She doesn't carry an ID." The officer didn't look pleased with the answer. "We're gonna need you all to come down to the station for further questioning." Mia's eyes widened. "What? On what grounds?" The stocky officer stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt. "Ma'am, we're not asking. We're telling. You can either come voluntarily, or we can do this the hard way." Zoe's hand gripped Daniel's arm. "Dad," she whispered, her voice shaking. Daniel felt a surge of anger, but forced it down, keeping his voice calm. "We haven't done anything wrong. You have no reason to detain us." The taller officer shrugged. "We'll sort that out at the station." And just like that, their peaceful vacation shattered. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, weighing his options, his FBI training battling with his instincts as a father. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of a confrontation that would test everything he believed in, about justice, resilience, and the country he had sworn to serve. The station was colder than Daniel had anticipated, both in temperature and in atmosphere. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare on the cracked linoleum floor as the family was led into a holding area. Malcolm clung to Mia's hand, his earlier joy now replaced by confusion. Zoe, visibly shaken, stayed close to Daniel, her eyes darting between the officers and the other detainees. Daniel's mind raced. He had been in countless precincts during his career, but this one was different. The disdain on the officers' faces wasn't hidden. It was blatant, calculated, and pointed directly at his family. It wasn't just an arrest. It was a performance. The taller officer, whom Daniel had learned was named Officer Grayson, smirked as he stood by the desk, leaning casually on it as if this were a routine occurrence. "You'll sit tight until we figure out what's going on," he said, his voice laced with indifference. Mia's voice cracked. "Figure out what? We've done nothing wrong." Grayson shrugged, his eyes barely acknowledging her. "Someone called it in. We're just doing our job." Daniel could feel the tension in Mia's voice, but he knew raising their volume wouldn't help. Instead, he stepped forward, his tone measured but firm. "Officer, I'm asking again. On what basis are you detaining us? This is unlawful." Grayson barely looked up. "Unlawful? That's a big word for someone who's under suspicion." The other officer, who hadn't said much since they'd arrived, snorted. "Look, if you've got nothing to hide, you'll cooperate. Simple as that." Daniel stared at them, his jaw tightening. His FBI instinct screamed at him to end this now, flash his badge, assert his authority, but his training reminded him of the mission. He couldn't afford to blow his cover, not yet. The stakes were too high. Across the room, a man in a disheveled suit and handcuffs sneered at them from a holding cell. "Another day, another tourist thinking they own the place," he muttered loudly. Zoe's lip quivered, but she quickly steeled herself, her teenage defiance rising. "This is ridiculous," she said, glaring at the officers. "You're only doing this because we're black." Grayson straightened, his smirk fading for a moment before returning with a sharper edge. "Careful with those accusations, young lady." "Accusations?" Zoe snapped. "You dragged us in here with no evidence, no explanation. You think we don't know what this is about?" Mia put a hand on Zoe's shoulder, trying to calm her, but her own fear and anger were palpable. "Zoe, not now." "No, Mom." Zoe's voice cracked, her composure slipping. "They're treating us like criminals." "And for what? Eating ice cream?" Daniel stepped between Zoe and the officers, his voice low and controlled. "Enough, Zoe! Let me handle this." The officers exchanged glances, their smug expressions briefly faltering under Daniel's steady gaze. He wasn't yelling, wasn't panicking, and that unnerved them. They were used to their victims reacting emotionally, making it easier to justify their actions. But Daniel's calm was deliberate, surgical. "Officer Grayson," Daniel said, his voice carrying an authority that made the man flinch slightly. "You have my identification, my wife's, and you know we haven't committed any crime. So let me ask you this. What are you really trying to accomplish here?" Grayson's smirk disappeared entirely, replaced by a thin veneer of professionalism. "We're just following protocol." Daniel took a step closer, his tone sharper. "Then you know you're out of line. Protocol doesn't allow you to detain a family on hearsay without probable cause. So why are we still here?" The room fell silent for a moment, the tension thick enough to cut. Grayson's partner cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable, but Grayson wasn't ready to back down. "Look, you're free to call a lawyer if you think we're out of line," Grayson said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. "But until then, you're staying put." Daniel could feel Mia's hand tighten around his arm, a silent plea to end this peacefully. Malcolm, sensing the tension, buried his face in Mia's side. Zoe's hands were clenched into fists, her knuckles white. Then, in the corner of his eye, Daniel noticed something, an officer at another desk, typing something into a computer. The officer's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing his face as he glanced at the screen, then back at Daniel. Daniel's heart sank. Had his cover been blown? No, it couldn't be. His mission files were sealed. But the officer's glance lingered, his brow furrowed. Grayson didn't notice, too preoccupied with maintaining his facade of authority. But Daniel made a mental note. That officer knew something. Whether it was about Daniel's real identity or the corruption Daniel suspected within the precinct, he wasn't sure. Yet, Grayson's voice broke the silence. "Until we verify everything, you're staying here. Period." Daniel nodded slowly, calculating his next move. For now, he had to play along, biding his time while keeping his family safe. But his mind was already working through scenarios, options, contingency plans. He wasn't just going to let this slide, not for his family, and not for the mission. As they were ushered toward a holding area, Daniel exchanged a glance with Zoe, who gave him a small, determined nod. Whatever came next, they would face it together. But deep down, Daniel knew this was far from over. Daniel sat in the holding area, his mind racing through the events that had led them here. Every second spent in this station felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked for. He scanned the room, taking in every detail: the outdated computer monitors, the worn-down desks, the casual arrogance of the officers who sauntered past without sparing a glance. His family sat beside him, the weight of the situation pressing down on all of them. Malcolm, still too young to fully understand, leaned against Mia, quietly asking if they were in trouble. Mia reassured him with a soft, trembling voice, though her eyes betrayed her fear. Zoe, on the other hand, burned with a quiet fury, her arms crossed tightly as she glared at the officers. Daniel could feel her gaze shift to him occasionally, a mix of anger and confusion. She didn't understand why her father, who always seemed larger than life, wasn't taking control of the situation. He knew she wanted answers, but he also knew now wasn't the time. He had seen what happened to people who pushed back too hard in situations like this. And the stakes were higher than just their dignity. He couldn't jeopardize the mission. Across the room, he noticed an officer, younger than the others, sitting stiffly at a desk. His eyes darted between Daniel's family and a computer screen. There was something about the way he hesitated, the way his brow furrowed, that caught Daniel's attention. The officer seemed out of place, like someone who hadn't yet been fully indoctrinated into the toxic culture of the precinct. Daniel filed that observation away for later. For now, his priority was keeping his family safe while maintaining his cover. He leaned forward slightly, keeping his voice low so only Mia and Zoe could hear him. "We're going to get through this," he said, his tone calm and deliberate. "But I need you both to stay strong and stay quiet. Let me handle it." Zoe scoffed quietly, her voice a harsh whisper. "Handle it? How, Dad? By just sitting here and letting them treat us like criminals." Daniel's eyes locked onto hers, his expression soft but firm. "I need you to trust me, Zoe. I know it doesn't make sense right now, but I have a plan." Her gaze wavered, but she nodded reluctantly. Mia placed a reassuring hand on Zoe's knee, offering her a small, encouraging smile despite her own unease. An officer approached them, clipboard in hand, his expression neutral but distant. "We're running your IDs now," he said flatly. "Shouldn't take too long. Just sit tight." Daniel nodded, maintaining a polite facade. "We appreciate your efficiency," he replied evenly, though the officer didn't acknowledge him before walking away. Mia leaned closer to Daniel, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's the plan? You keep saying you have one, but we're sitting here with no idea what's going on." Daniel hesitated. He couldn't reveal everything, not in front of the other officers, not even to his family. The risk was too great. "I'm watching, listening," he said softly. "There's more going on here than just us. I just need time to figure it out." Mia looked like she wanted to say more, but the exhaustion in her eyes told Daniel she was too worn out to argue. He squeezed her hand gently, a silent reassurance that he hadn't lost control of the situation. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. The tension in the room was palpable. Daniel watched as officers exchanged glances, whispered to one another, and occasionally looked in their direction. There was a pattern to their behavior, a rhythm he was starting to pick apart. He could sense the underlying tension, the nervous energy that came with trying to hide something. Then, the younger officer he had noticed earlier hesitated near their holding area. His hands fidgeted slightly as he glanced at Daniel, then at his clipboard. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Sir," he began, his voice quieter than the others. "Can I have a word?" Daniel nodded, standing carefully. He followed the officer to a corner of the room, aware of the stares from the other officers. The younger man looked nervous, his eyes darting to ensure they weren't being overheard. "Look," the officer said, his voice low. "I don't know what's going on here, but this doesn't feel right. You shouldn't be here." Daniel studied him carefully. The officer's discomfort was genuine, and Daniel decided to take a calculated risk. "What do you know?" he asked, keeping his tone measured. The officer hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "I've seen some things in this department. Things that don't add up. The chief, he's got ties to some people who aren't exactly law-abiding." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't let his expression change. "Go on." "There's been talk," the officer continued, "about surveillance, about people being watched. Your name came up when they ran your ID. I don't know what they found, but whatever it is, it's not routine." Daniel nodded, his mind working quickly. If the department had flagged his identity, it could compromise not just him, but the entire operation. He had to act fast, but he couldn't tip his hand too soon. "Thank you," he said, his tone sincere. "What's your name?" The officer hesitated. "Officer Davis." "Davis," Daniel said, locking eyes with him. "You did the right thing, but I need you to keep this quiet for now. Can you do that?" Davis nodded reluctantly. "Yeah, I can. Just be careful." Daniel returned to his family, his mind racing. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but time was running out. He couldn't afford to wait much longer. Whatever the department was hiding, it was bigger than a simple arrest. And Daniel knew he was the only one who could stop it. Daniel sat back down next to Mia and Zoe, his mind a storm of calculations. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to act, but the wrong move could endanger everything, his family, his mission, and potentially lives far beyond this precinct. He glanced at Zoe, who was sitting stiffly, staring at the ground. Her earlier defiance had dimmed, replaced by a quiet but simmering frustration. Mia looked tired, her hand resting on Malcolm's head as the boy dozed against her shoulder, oblivious to the growing tension around them. Daniel leaned closer to Mia, speaking softly so only she could hear. "We need to stay calm for a little longer. I've got an idea, but I'll need you to trust me." Mia didn't respond immediately. She searched his face, trying to read the plan he wasn't saying out loud. Finally, she nodded, her grip on Malcolm tightening. "Just get us out of this." Daniel's mind shifted into gear. He had no access to his usual tools, no immediate backup, and his identity was a carefully guarded secret he couldn't afford to reveal. What he did have, however, was years of training, experience in handling hostile situations, and the ability to read people better than anyone in the room. He caught the eye of Officer Davis again, who was now stationed at the far side of the room, typing on a computer. Davis looked up briefly, meeting Daniel's gaze, and then quickly looked back down, clearly trying to appear inconspicuous. That brief connection was all Daniel needed. Davis wasn't entirely loyal to the toxic environment of this precinct, and he might be the key to unlocking the next step. Daniel leaned back, pretending to relax, but his attention was on every movement in the room. Grayson was across the way, talking to another officer in hushed tones. They kept glancing in his direction, their body language tense, but trying to appear casual. Daniel knew that look. It was the look of people covering something up. He turned to Zoe and whispered, "Zoe, I need you to listen carefully." She looked up, her frustration giving way to curiosity. "What?" "When the time is right, I need you to make a distraction. Nothing big, just enough to pull their attention for a minute. Can you do that?" Her brows furrowed, but then she nodded. "What kind of distraction?" "Anything. Just don't make it obvious it's planned. I'll handle the rest." Zoe didn't ask any more questions. She trusted him, even if she didn't fully understand what he was doing. Daniel stood up and walked calmly toward the water fountain at the edge of the room, placing himself closer to Davis. He could feel the eyes of the other officers on him, but he ignored them, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. As he passed Davis, he spoke quietly but firmly. "We need to talk. Somewhere they can't hear us." Davis hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He didn't respond verbally, but after a moment, he stood and walked toward the hallway leading to the restrooms. Daniel followed, keeping a casual pace, ensuring the other officers wouldn't think twice about it. Once they were out of earshot, Davis turned, his expression tense. "What's going on? What are you planning?" Daniel got straight to the point. "I need access to your system. Whatever flagged my name, it's tied to something bigger. I think your department's connected to a domestic terror cell." Davis blinked, clearly taken aback. "What are you talking about?" Daniel stepped closer, his voice steady but urgent. "I'm a federal agent. I've been working undercover on a case involving this precinct and its connections to an extremist group. My family being here? That wasn't part of the plan, but now it's a liability. I need your help to get to the bottom of this before someone gets hurt." Davis looked around nervously, making sure no one was nearby. "If you're really an agent, why don't you just call for backup? Because blowing my cover now could compromise everything. The people I'm after are smart, and if they know I'm onto them, they'll disappear. I can't let that happen. Davis hesitated, clearly torn. If I get caught helping you. You won't, Daniel interrupted. You've already taken a risk by talking to me. You know something's wrong here, or you wouldn't have stepped in. Now's your chance to do the right thing. Davis exhaled slowly, then nodded. What do you need? Access to the files on me and anything flagged under extremist activity in the past 6 months. And I need it fast. Davis nodded again, his movements tense but determined. I'll see what I can do. Daniel returned to the holding area, his expression neutral. Mia gave him a questioning look, but he shook his head slightly, a silent message to wait. A few minutes later, Davis returned, walking briskly toward his desk. He didn't look at Daniel, but Daniel noticed the subtle signal, Davis tapping his pen twice against the desk. It was done. Zoe caught her father's eye, silently asking if it was time. Daniel gave her the smallest nod. A moment later, Zoe stood abruptly, knocking over the chair she'd been sitting in. What is this? She said loudly, drawing every eye in the room. We're just supposed to sit here and take this? Grayson turned, scowling. Sit down, kid. No, Zoe shouted, her voice trembling just enough to seem genuine. We haven't done anything wrong, and you know it. Grayson started walking toward her, his irritation obvious. Other officers turned their attention to the commotion, momentarily distracted. Daniel used the opportunity to move closer to Davis's desk, subtly glancing at the screen as he passed. What he saw confirmed his suspicions. The file showed more than just a routine check. His name had been flagged not for a simple traffic stop, but as part of a larger investigation connected to the extremist group he was tracking. Worse, there were indications that some members of the precinct were actively collaborating with the group, feeding them information. Daniel returned to his seat just as Grayson reached Zoe, his voice harsh. That's enough out of you. Then do something about it. Zoe snapped, her voice defiant. Grayson glared at her, but ultimately backed off, muttering under his breath as he returned to his desk. The distraction had worked. Daniel now had the confirmation he needed. The next step was clear, but he would need to act quickly before the officers realized the extent of what he was planning. The pieces were falling into place, but the game wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Daniel's heart raced as he pieced together the fragments of information from Davis's screen. The connection was undeniable now. This wasn't just a case of routine racial profiling. The officers in this precinct were actively complicit in something much larger, much darker, than they wanted anyone to believe. The extremist group he had been tracking for months wasn't just operating in the shadows. They had allies within the law. He glanced at his family, sitting tense but composed. Mia gave him a questioning look, silently asking if it was time to act. Daniel shook his head slightly. Not yet. He needed to be certain his next move wouldn't put them in more danger. Every moment counted, but every misstep could cost them dearly. Across the room, Grayson was still watching Zoe with narrowed eyes, his ego bruised from her defiance. He muttered something to his partner, and they both laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound. Daniel clenched his fists, but forced himself to stay calm. Anger wouldn't help him here, precision would. Officer Davis moved from his desk to a filing cabinet, his movements deliberate but tense. As he opened the drawer, he tilted his body slightly, shielding a small object in his hand. Daniel recognized the move immediately. Davis was passing him something. He subtly adjusted his position as Davis approached. "Sir," Davis said in a low voice, addressing Daniel directly for the first time in front of the others. "We're moving your family to a different holding area. This one's getting crowded." Daniel caught the subtle flick of Davis's hand and felt the small keycard slip into his palm. He didn't react outwardly, simply nodding. "Appreciate it, officer." Davis gestured for Mia and Zoe to follow him, leaving Daniel behind momentarily, with Malcolm still asleep against Mia's shoulder. Daniel could see the uncertainty in Mia's eyes as she hesitated, but he gave her a small nod of reassurance. "Go with him. I'll be right behind you." As they exited, Daniel turned his focus to the keycard in his hand. It wasn't labeled, but he knew what it was for. Davis had just given him access to something they weren't supposed to see, likely the secured evidence room or a restricted system. The officers at the desk were still distracted, their attention split between chatting and watching the exit where Mia and Zoe had just left. Daniel stood, stretching slightly as though trying to shake off discomfort, and began walking toward the back hallway where Davis had indicated earlier. He passed by Grayson, who shot him a suspicious look. "Where are you headed?" Grayson asked, his tone casual but laced with condescension. "Restroom," Daniel said without breaking stride. Grayson muttered something under his breath but didn't follow, and Daniel quickly disappeared down the hallway. The keycard fit into the scanner at the end of the hall, and the lock clicked open. He slipped inside, closing the door softly behind him. Inside, the room was dimly lit, lined with shelves of files, computers, and other pieces of evidence. Daniel moved quickly, inserting the keycard into one of the terminals. The screen lit up, and a login prompt appeared. Davis must have programmed the card to bypass the system, because the screen immediately unlocked, revealing folders labeled with case numbers and operation codes. He searched through the files until he found what he was looking for, Operation Sentinel. It was the cover name for the extremist group's activities in the area. What he saw chilled him: financial transactions, surveillance reports, and communication logs between the group and members of the precinct. It wasn't just a case of a few bad cops. This was systemic. The precinct had been covering for the group, providing them with information on local activists, tracking federal investigations, and even supplying them with resources. Worse, there was a plan in motion, a coordinated attack scheduled to take place that evening. Daniel didn't have time to process the weight of it. He quickly copied the files onto a flash drive he had hidden in his sock, ensuring he'd have evidence to take to the FBI. The mission parameters had changed. This wasn't about keeping his cover anymore. It was about stopping an imminent threat. As he moved to leave, he heard voices outside the door. Someone was coming. Daniel scanned the room quickly, finding a shelf just out of sight of the entrance. He ducked behind it, holding his breath as the door creaked open. It was Grayson. The officer stepped inside, looking around suspiciously. "I know you're in here," he called, his voice sharp. "You think you can outsmart us? You're gonna regret it." Daniel didn't move, his body tense as he calculated his options. Grayson moved further into the room, his hand resting on his holster. Just as Grayson passed his hiding spot, Daniel acted. In one swift motion, he stepped out and disarmed the officer, twisting his wrist and forcing the gun to the ground. Grayson struggled, but Daniel's training gave him the upper hand. "Stay quiet," Daniel hissed, pitting Grayson against the wall. "You're going to listen very carefully. I know what you're involved in. I know about the attack. And if you don't want this to end badly for you, you're going to stay out of my way." Grayson froze, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and rage. "You're bluffing," he spat. Daniel pressed him harder against the wall. "Try me. The FBI knows everything. Your days of hiding behind that badge are over." He released Grayson and picked up the officer's gun, ejecting the magazine and tossing it across the room. "Consider this your only warning." Daniel slipped out of the room before Grayson could recover, heading back toward the holding area where Mia and Zoe were waiting. His cover was likely blown, but it didn't matter anymore. The evidence he had collected was enough to bring the entire operation down, and he wasn't leaving until he knew his family was safe and the threat was neutralized. The clock was ticking, but Daniel had everything he needed. Now, it was time to act. Daniel walked back into the holding area, his face calm, but his mind racing. He had the evidence in hand, and knew exactly what needed to be done, but the situation was becoming more volatile by the second. Grayson's reaction in the evidence room had confirmed the depth of the corruption, and Daniel knew it was only a matter of time before the officers in the precinct realized something was wrong. Mia looked up as he entered, her eyes filled with questions she couldn't voice in front of the officers. Zoe, still holding on to her frustration, glanced at him with a mix of curiosity and impatience. Daniel gave them both a subtle nod, a silent signal that they needed to be ready. Grayson re-entered moments later, his face flushed with anger, but his demeanor unusually restrained. He shot a glance at the other officers, muttering something under his breath. Daniel knew he was trying to decide whether to escalate the situation or play it cool. Either way, it gave Daniel a narrow window to execute the next step. Officer Davis approached cautiously, his movements careful and deliberate. He leaned in close enough for only Daniel to hear. "The files. Did you get what you needed?" Daniel nodded slightly. "More than enough. But we're not out of this yet." Davis hesitated, clearly torn between his duty to his colleagues and the moral weight of what he had already uncovered. "What's the plan?" he asked, his voice low. "Backup," Daniel said simply. "We need federal backup. Quietly. Can you handle that?" Davis nodded reluctantly. "There's a secure line in the back office. I can make the call, but I'll need a few minutes." "Make it quick," Daniel replied. As Davis moved toward the back office, Daniel turned his attention back to the room. The tension was thick, the officers now whispering among themselves, their eyes occasionally darting toward him and his family. Grayson was still fuming, his fingers tapping impatiently on the desk as he stared daggers at Daniel. Zoe broke the silence, her voice cutting through the room. "So, are we just going to sit here all day, or are you actually going to tell us why we're being held?" Grayson's head snapped up, and he opened his mouth to respond, but Daniel stepped in before he could speak. "Enough, Zoe," he said firmly, his tone carrying a quiet authority. "We're not giving them the satisfaction." She huffed but stayed silent, crossing her arms and leaning back in her chair. Daniel's focus shifted to the officers' movements. They were nervous, clearly sensing that the situation was slipping out of their control. One of them stood by the exit, blocking the door, while another pretended to shuffle paperwork but kept glancing at the clock. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually Davis returned, his face pale but determined. He didn't say anything, just gave Daniel a small nod. The call had been made. Backup was on the way. Now came the hard part, keeping the situation contained until help arrived. Grayson stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked over to Daniel, stopping just inches away. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, his voice low and venomous. Daniel met his gaze without flinching. "I don't know what you're talking about." Grayson smirked, leaning in closer. "You think I don't know what you're up to? You've been poking around where you don't belong. But let me tell you something, you're in my house now. And in my house, you play by my rules." Daniel held his ground, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Funny. I was about to say the same thing to you." The tension between them was palpable, the room falling silent as everyone watched the exchange. Grayson's smirk faltered for a brief moment, replaced by uncertainty. He knew Daniel wasn't bluffing, but he didn't know the extent of what Daniel had on him. Before Grayson could respond, the distant sound of sirens pierced the air. His head snapped toward the window, his expression shifting from anger to alarm. "What the hell is that?" one of the officers muttered. Daniel remained calm, his gaze steady, as he watched Grayson's reaction. "Looks like your house is about to get a lot more crowded." The sirens grew louder, and moments later, several unmarked black SUVs pulled up outside the precinct. Federal agents poured out, their movements swift and coordinated as they approached the building. Grayson stepped back, his bravado crumbling as the reality of the situation set in. He turned to the other officers, barking orders. "Lock the doors! Don't let them in!" But it was too late. The federal agents breached the precinct with precision, their presence immediately commanding attention. Davis stepped forward, identifying himself to the lead agent and pointing toward Daniel. "That's him," Davis said. "He's the one you need to talk to." The lead agent nodded, approaching Daniel with a firm but respectful demeanor. "Agent Hayes?" Daniel stood, pulling out his hidden badge and flashing it for all to see. "That's right. And I have everything you need to take this operation down." The room erupted into chaos. Grayson and the other corrupt officers tried to argue, but the federal agents quickly subdued them, confiscating their weapons and escorting them out of the room. Davis watched from the sidelines, visibly relieved that he had chosen the right side. Mia and Zoe stood, their expressions a mix of relief and exhaustion. Malcolm, now awake, looked around in confusion but seemed reassured by his father's calm demeanor. Daniel turned to his family, his voice softening. "It's over. We're safe." Mia exhaled deeply, pulling him into a tight embrace. "Don't ever do that to us again." "I won't," Daniel promised, though he knew this wouldn't be the last time his job would put them in danger. As the agents began collecting evidence and securing the precinct, Daniel handed over the flash drive, detailing everything he had uncovered. The lead agent nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "You just blew this case wide open. Good work, Hayes." Daniel nodded, his focus shifting back to his family. For now, the mission was complete, and the people who had endangered so many lives would face justice. But he also knew this was just one battle in a much larger war, one he was determined to keep fighting. The cleanup was swift but meticulous. Federal agents swarmed the precinct, cataloging evidence, taking statements, and processing the officers who had been complicit in the corruption. Daniel stood with his family near the edge of the chaos, his arm protectively around Mia as Zoe kept a steady eye on the remaining officers. The weight of the last few hours still hung heavily on all of them, but there was a sense of resolution in the air. A senior federal agent approached Daniel, his expression a mix of professionalism and respect. "Agent Hayes, we've confirmed the intel you provided. This precinct has been a hub for coordinated activities with the group we've been tracking. Your work here just dismantled a major part of their network." Daniel nodded, his face unreadable. "It wasn't just me. Officer Davis stepped up when it mattered. He made the call." The agent looked over at Davis, who stood off to the side, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "We'll make sure that's noted in the report," the agent said. "And your family, how are they holding up?" Daniel glanced at Mia and Zoe, who were both visibly exhausted but standing tall. "They'll be fine. We've been through worse, but I'll make sure they get the time they need to process this." The agent hesitated before lowering his voice. "You know this is going to attract a lot of attention. The media, internal reviews, it won't be easy." "It never is," Daniel replied simply. As the agent walked away, Daniel turned back to his family. Zoe stepped forward, her arms crossed, her expression hard to read. "So you're just back to work now? That's it?" Daniel met her gaze evenly. "This is my work, Zoe. What happened here? It's part of why I do what I do. So you and Malcolm can live in a world that's a little safer." Her frustration softened, replaced by a flicker of understanding. "I just don't get how you can deal with all of this and still keep it together." "I don't always keep it together," Daniel admitted. "But when it matters, I focus on what's important. And right now, that's making sure you and your mom are okay. Mia reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. We'll be okay, she said softly. But you need to make sure you're okay too. You can't carry everything on your own. Daniel nodded, appreciating her words even though he wasn't sure how to let go of the weight he carried. It was part of the job, part of who he was. But for now, he was grateful just to have them safe. Across the room, Davis approached hesitantly, his expression cautious. Agent Hayes, he began, awkwardly addressing Daniel by his title for the first time. I just wanted to say, I didn't know how bad it was. I'm sorry for what your family went through. Daniel studied him for a moment before nodding. You did the right thing when it counted. That's what matters. Davis looked relieved but still uneasy. What happens now? To the department, to the others? They'll be held accountable, Daniel said firmly. Every single one of them. But you've got a choice. You can either walk away from all of this or stay and be part of the change. Davis frowned, clearly weighing the decision. I don't know if I'm cut out for that. You are, Daniel said. But it's up to you. As Davis walked away, deep in thought, Daniel turned back to his family. Zoe was watching him closely, her expression more thoughtful than before. You really believe people can change, don't you? She asked. I have to, Daniel replied. If I didn't, I wouldn't be able to do this job. The family was escorted out of the precinct, the night air cool and refreshing after the suffocating tension inside. The streets were quieter now, though the flashing lights of the federal vehicles still lit up the area. Daniel helped Mia and Zoe into the car, with Malcolm now fast asleep in the back seat, oblivious to the chaos that had unfolded. As they drove away from the scene, Mia broke the silence. Do you think this will actually make a difference? Exposing them, holding them accountable. It has to, Daniel said. Maybe not all at once, but it's a start. And sometimes that's enough. Zoe leaned her head against the window, her voice quieter now. You're not just doing this for us, are you? It's for everyone. Daniel glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression softening. It's for the people who don't get a second chance. The ones who get silenced, ignored, or worse. If I can do something to change that, even a little, it's worth it. The weight of his words hung in the air, but this time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt purposeful, like the beginning of something larger than any of them. By the time they reached their hotel, the exhaustion had fully set in. Mia carried Malcolm inside, while Zoe stayed behind with Daniel, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Do you think they'll remember this? The people in that precinct, the ones who saw what happened. They'll remember, Daniel said quietly. But what they do with it, that's up to them. Zoe nodded, seeming to accept his answer. I'm proud of you, Dad. Even if I don't always understand it. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. That means more than you know. As they entered the hotel room, the weight of the day finally lifted, replaced by the quiet relief of safety. For now, they were together, and that was enough. But as Daniel looked out the window at the town below, he knew the work was far from over. There were more battles to fight, more lives to protect, and more people to hold accountable. And he was ready for all of it. Because this wasn't just his job. It was his legacy.